So first of all, I'd like to thank Linda for taking the initiative in publishing, or rather republishing, a new edition of this pamphlet here, Breaking the Chains. In the, 36 years since 1981, when we published it first, I've often taken it off my shelves and looked at it, and every time I've looked at it, I've smiled, which I can't say about all the books I've taken off my bookshelves over the years. And that's because when I think of the 5 people who put it together and the circumstances in which we put it together in, the whole thing just reminds me of what a very enjoyable, what a very harmonious collaboration it was, very much enhanced by the homemade jam made by Madge Davison. And anyone who's tried to write any text with another person knows how difficult it is to collaborate with one other person. And there were 5 of us. And we were 5 very strong women. And despite any difficulties that you might expect, it didn't happen. It was a very harmonious, a very enjoyable enterprise. Probably because we were united in our passion at the time, and still, I think, for women's emancipation. And we were also convinced that as women, we could only break our chains when we joined with other groups and sections and classes in society who needed to break theirs as well. The Communist Party had organised a seminar, a weekend in 1980, I think, and as a result of the discussions we had there, we decided that it would be a good idea to look further into what James Connolly had written about women. Now, in those days, most people thought James Connolly hadn't written anything about women. And I suspect that Linda was behind this initiative, as she's been behind so many initiatives to do with the women's movement and the Communist Party and the wider, broader working class movement. And if you can put yourself into our shoes in 1980, 1981, which is probably quite difficult to do, because things have changed in many ways quite a lot since then, but also there are some things, of course, that haven't changed at all. In 1980, 1981, Northern Ireland was riven by civil conflict, and yet the ideas emanating from the second wave of feminism that had spread across Europe and North America made quite an impact here. In 1975, the Northern Ireland Women's Rights Movement was established, and indeed in that same year, the first Women's Aid Refuge in Belfast was opened up. In 1979, the First Women's Centre was opened in Belfast. In Donegal Street, which wasn't in the posh cathedral quarter in those days, I can tell you. And there are many more examples of women and women's groups who were becoming active at that time. In fact, too many, really, to mention. There were women in community groups, leading community groups. There were women in political parties. Women were really on the move. There was a real burgeoning of the women's movement in Belfast at the time, which brought together, despite the violence that was going on all around us, which brought together women from across the sectarian divide and provided a space where we could meet and talk and organise. It's also hard to imagine now that in 1980, 1981, there hadn't hardly been anything published on women and socialism in Ireland in the previous 60 years. In fact, since Connolly had written about women and socialism in Ireland, very little had been published at all. It wasn't until 1983, with Margaret Ward's groundbreaking Unmanageable Revolutionaries, that the work began on excavating the history of women in the labour movement, in the women's movement, and elsewhere in Ireland. This process, of course, isn't finished yet, but I would like to say that for me, it reached a particular high point last year, this day last year, in fact, when the Irish state, for the first time on International Women's Day, held a special commemoration to mark the contribution that women had made before, during, and after the 1916 uprising. So in the last 60 years, women have begun to be written again into history. And this was what Connolly had to say about this in 1908. He called in those days for a women's history of Ireland to be written. And he said, what a history that would be, which would tell us the history of the real women of Ireland, the women of the people. What a record of ceaseless suffering, of heroism, of martyrdom. A recital of patient toil, of uncomplaining self-sacrifice. Aye, and what a brilliant tale of things accomplished, of deeds done, of miracles achieved. So in the intervening 36 years, that work has indeed been done, and women, or has been started rather, and women have begun to be written into our history. So our little pamphlet in 1981 was kind of at the beginning of all of this. Not, as Linda has quite rightly said, that it was an academic piece of work. It wasn't. And it wasn't a history of women in Ireland. All we really wanted to do was to draw attention to what one of the leading socialist thinkers and organisers of the early 20th century in Ireland, namely James Connolly, had to say about women. And given the status of Connolly in the Communist Party, I think we secretly hoped that Connolly might be our secret weapon to persuade some of our less enthusiastic male comrades about what was known as the women's question in those days, and to persuade them that this ought to perhaps to be taken a little more seriously. Connolly took a particular interest in the working conditions of women in Ireland and urged them to unite by joining a trade union to secure their rights. He wrote, and this is where we got the title of our pamphlet from. He wrote in The Reconquest of Ireland, "None so fitted to break the chains as they who wear them, none so well equipped to decide what is a fetter. In its march towards freedom, the working classes in Ireland must cheer on the efforts of those women who, feeling on their souls and bodies the fetters of the ages, have risen to strike them off, and cheer all the louder, if in its hatred of thraldom and passion for freedom, the women's army forges ahead of the militant army of labour." This, of course, turned out to be hopelessly optimistic. However, Connolly's call still resonates today, or perhaps resonates again today, in an age of zero-hours contracts, banning of trade unions by global corporations, and the totally inadequate childcare arrangements that are available both north and south of the border. In rereading our 1981 pamphlet, I've been struck by how many of Connolly's ideas remain central to debates today about the position of women in society, and also his comments about the relationship between the women's movement and the labour movement. I'm also struck by the ways in which we disagreed with Connolly in 1981, which wasn't, when I look back on it, which wasn't particularly looked upon very well in certain parts of the Communist Party at the time. His views on divorce, for example, were ones that we couldn't share, and his relative neglect of non-economic issues when it comes to relations between men and women was another issue that where we couldn't agree with Connolly. We wrote at the time, and I think this is interesting, "While it is a major task of the proletarian women's movement under capitalism to work for revolutionary change in the economic relations in our society, we cannot and must not neglect to lay the foundations for the ideological revolution, without which a purely economic liberation would be sterile." In our revolutionary fervour, towards the end of this little pamphlet, I remember we wrote, and I can remember the moment when we decided on this phrase as a breakthrough moment. We wrote, "There is no necessary connection between menstruation and scrubbing floors." And that very much and that very much sums up the flavour of the period and of the time that we were writing. So our pamphlet stands as a document of its time, but I think it still addresses, more's the pity, a lot of the issues facing the women's movement today. then as now, it hopefully makes the reader more aware of what a progressive thinker Connolly really was, and hopefully directs the reader to examine in more detail Connolly's writings on women, of which lots more has been written in the meantime, and makes you reflect what a different place Ireland might be today if he and many like him had lived. So that's all I have to say, and I recommend the pamphlet to you very much. So, Linda, back to you.